Well, welcome everyone. I hopefully I was all happy that we got it all good to go and no issues today. So, my name is Jackie Caratini, Family Living Agents with the UW Extension Office, and this is our third in our series. So, and we'll take a deeper dive into credit. So we're going to talk a little bit about credit. Questions, if you have any questions, and this goes for Marshfield too, please chime in. So this is we're a small group today, but very informal. So stop me at any time, and we'll just kind of go back and forth. So I want to make sure you do get your questions answered. And I did not give copies of the PowerPoint, so I did that purposely because I'm going to use this kind of just as a talking guide. So I really want to, at points, we're going to go more through the handout that I did give you, and we'll cover all those things in there, but this really is just kind of a conversation. So if there are things that come up that you say, oh, I really want to talk about why, when I went for an auto loan, their credit score was not the same as the one, on my app, ask me that. Because we'll talk about that. So if something comes up and we haven't got there, please ask me those things, because there's so much that I want to make sure we get everything you want to know answered. Good? Okay. So I always start off with this. Vince Lombardi, if winning isn't everything, then why do they keep score? So the idea of credit is, I never know what's in here. It's the idea of what you yourself, what is your history? And they have to know, and we'll get into that on the next slide, is what is your value and how can they trust you? And so and I think, 30, 40, 50 years ago, there was a very few people who actually used your credit score, your credit history for things, and now so many more people actually use it. So it's really saying, are you going to do what you said you're going to do? And so that's what they're actually valuing it on, and they're basing it on. And so it's this whole idea of they're going to give you, something, and they're going to use your history to say, yes, you repay it back. And so it's not necessarily just financial, it's a lot of other things as well, and it's evolved over the years, and it's become this base of a lot of things that we do. So what's happened in society is if you get in trouble with your credit history, or if you are starting out either as a young person, or let's say you go through a divorce, or you have a financial, a traumatic event in your life, medical issues, or like I said, divorce or a transition or different things, and you have no credit, it's really hard to start off in transition because so many things are based on this. So it really is important. And if you did come to my one in the spring and we were talking about your credit score, you've heard me tell this story. Not a long time ago, because I've been around for a long time, but about a year and a half ago, I was doing a veterans fair up in Rhinelander, and I was talking about the importance of pulling your credit score. And I was asking all these vets as they came through, have you pulled your credit score? And overwhelmingly, everybody said, no, my credit is good. No, my credit is good. And then I'd say, but this isn't really about that. This is really about finding out what's in your report, because you need to know that your identity hasn't been stolen. And then they would tell me, oh yeah, it has. And then I started keeping a tally, and this is in Rhinelander. So Rhinelander is very rural. It's not a very highly populated place. Over the course of that day, I still have it on my laptop, a little thing. I had 78 people that told me that their identity had been stolen within the last 3 years. Okay, so it just so happened that this was one of those things and they all were saying, I have good credit, I have good credit, I have good credit. There's so many other things that are a part of this. So it's not just about your score. And so those people, if they had not, and I hate those words, those people, but those participants, if they had not checked it and didn't know what was in there, and they did go for a loan thinking that they did have a really good credit score, they might not be able to get it or rent an apartment, or, maybe they're retiring and they're going to go get a condo, down in Florida. They wouldn't be able to, because if it was pulled and someone else had hacked into their credit and all of a sudden there's all these other things in their report that weren't them, they could be in trouble. So that's why it all kind of goes together. So it's one of those things that they are separate, but they kind of intertwine. So Okay, so who cares about your credit? Like I said, before it used to be financial institutions. Now there's so many other people that really look into your credit. So some of the really big ones, yep, are still those financial institutions. Insurance companies is huge. So again, they're looking to see if you're trustworthy and what your risk is, okay? So if you're a higher risk, they say if you have a lower credit score, you're going to be a higher risk of a for insurance. So then you're going to get a higher premium. So it's one of those things that it's not necessarily true, but overall, that's kind of how they look at it. So that one really does affect it, and it's very important. Landlords, employers, utility companies, not always in our area, but more and more in Wisconsin are starting to do this. Some government agencies, and everybody should care about it. Other ones that you guys have seen that isn't on my list that have pulled it, that you've been surprised at? Okay. So we're finding more and more. Okay, somebody said something. More and more that, again, people are popping up and saying, holy smokes, they pulled my credit and I had no idea. That's the other part about you pulling your credit report, is because you can see who pulled it too. And when I just worked with someone last week, and I helped him pull it, and he's like, well, what are these companies? And the interesting thing is they come up with as these shell companies. So one of the ones last week, it was like 3 digits, RJF Enterprises. And he's like, oh, this is, somebody scamming me. This is my identity was stolen. And then the more we dug into it, he had applied for a new job, and that was the shell corporation for, the parent corporation for one of the places that he had applied for the job, and they had pulled it. But, it wasn't what it was, but we'll say it was Quick Trip, where he had applied, but that's not what showed up on his credit report. So that's another thing, is to make sure that you know what it is, and maybe even ask when you apply places what it is, so you know what you're looking for, because that's not what shows up on there, and it would be a red flag for you, and you'd be very concerned. Okay, so I'm just going to pull a lot of these up. Sorry. Okay, so there's a lot of places that do give credit. So like I said, one of the things that happens, especially when you're starting out, or if you had a transition in life, like divorce, or maybe there was a major financial thing like medical, or you did have to file bankruptcy and you're starting over, those kind of things. You're trying to build, and you're trying to figure out kind of where stuff comes from. And we'll get there a little bit later. One of the pieces is, what are your different sources? And a lot of people will say, well, that's a big chunk of my credit score. How do I know what are the different sources, and what do they mean by that? And so this is what they're going at. Like, how many different varieties and different things where is it coming from? So it's not all coming necessarily from your bank or your credit union and what's in your checking and your savings. It's also, do you have any credit cards, and is anything out there? Do you have a mortgage? Do you have an insurance? Is that getting? Is there any government loans? Did you have student loans? Anything like that? Was there anything that was not paid, like taxes or liens, that was reported into there? Are there auto loans? Things like that. So lots of different things. Yes?
The slides aren't moving for us.
Oh. Okay.
I'll be IT here for a second.
He's going to hop in. Hold on.
Yeah, I just realized, I'm like, we've been on the same slide for a long time.
Okay.
So these aren't changing, are they?
No.
So now is it changing for you?
Yeah, now it's on that one.
Interesting.
Okay, well, I can change it on there.
Yeah, maybe it's set manually, because I don't know
Okay.
why the clicker's not working. Well,
Okay, so we are on. Oh, how,
that one.
oh, where did it go?
Do you want me to stay over
Okay.
here and click for
Nope, that's okay. I can get it. Okay.
Can you full screen? Is that possible?
Oh, you're not even on the full screen?
No, I can see what you guys are doing behind the scenes right now.
Oh, well, that would explain it.
We can see your boards, Adam.
Let's see.
We thought we were being so slick, like we had it all taken care of. Okay, you keep going. I'm gonna keep talking.
Yeah. Oh.
So that's one of the things they say is how many different sources of credit do you have? So this is what they're going at. And so do you have a variety of sources of credit? So again, when we go back, it's not even that long, 10, 15 years ago, for a while they were saying, oh, credit cards are bad. Don't have credit cards, that's bad. And there's actually some very prominent people out there that say, oh, only use cash, credit is bad. Not necessarily like when it comes to your credit score, unless you are going to pay, if you don't want a mortgage, you're going to pay cash for your mortgage, things like that, you're going to need credit. And if you are, a variety of things do help. And we'll get into that in a little bit because there's certain happens. So if we did, let's say, have auto loan, and we'll talk about that. And if you close it out, then we have one less type of credit. Then we have one less amount of our credit sources, and that actually can drop your score. So it really just depends. So this variety actually is really important. And that's one of the pieces in your pie as we kind of move through your total score. Yeah.
Does that mean the pieces that you have currently, or the history?
It's your history.
Okay.
So, well, hang on to that question, because when we get there, history it's a section of it, and it'll ask how long you have it. So so on your, and we'll get there, we'll talk about it. So on your credit report, it'll say, like your banking and checking account, how long have you had it? It'll say 15, 20 years. That shows up on there. It'll tell you when you opened it or how long you had it, or your mortgage. And the longer that you've had it, that longevity of the credit, and that you've been able to maintain it in good standing, is greater. So that's really important. But that doesn't mean that you can't open a new credit card and it won't jump something. It just depends. And we'll give an example. It depends where your credit is at. So you can have a very good credit score, like a 750, and you can open a new credit card and it's not going to budget at all. You can have a 600 credit score, open a new credit card, and make 3 consistent monthly payments, and it might jump your score 20 points. So it really depends where you're at in your particular situation and what the whole big pie is, because it's going to be different for everybody. Does that make sense? But that longevity is really important, and that the amount of places that you're getting your credit from is really important. Does that make sense? Am I more confusing?
No.
Okay. Did we lose you?
We're still there. I can't get it full screen. I thought I had this.
Okay. Can you guys hear me though in Marshfield?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay.
It's just fine to see the screen.
On the bottom, it just shows, now it shows Adam up close.
I think when I talk, it'll show me.
So I guess my point is, if we could get rid of that.
Sorry, she had to take a call that she was waiting for. Okay, so. But yeah, that's gonna be, that's the.
Usually go
So
slideshow.
it
full
won't
screen,
show
and then
slideshow? Sorry, everybody.
Go to slideshow from beginning, from current slide. Click from current.
Oh yeah,
slide.
there's no. Okay, so they can't see that?
Is that better?
Can you guys see that now?
Yep, and now it's moving.
It's moving. Whoop whoop. Okay.
I don't want to brag. It like took me 10
No,
minutes.
okay, it's okay. I knew we were too good to be true. Okay, so again, credit is one of those things that if you have it and you use it well, it's a great tool. If it gets in trouble, it can really tank you in all aspects of life. And so that's all we'll say about that. Okay. We'll get into this a little bit more later, but the idea of how much, this is a question, I throw this in there, it's a little bit out of place in the slideshow, but this is something I get asked a lot, like how much is too much? Like what should be our limit and kind of where should it be at? And so kind of a good guideline is no more than 20% of your annual income, and then your payments should be less than 10% of your income. And especially don't include your housing in that, but it shouldn't be more than that. If it is, then you're getting into the part where it's probably too much and it's going to be uncomfortable for you, and you're going to have a hard time making your payments, okay? Because you have all your other basic living expenses that are going to come into there. Okay, So let's talk a little bit about our credit scores. So FICO is the most commonly used one. Then there's also the Vantage score, and then there's a lot of other ones that are kind of in there. The three bureaus, Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax, and we'll talk a little bit about those. There's a lot of, if you've ever gone for credit, and like I said this question in the beginning, I don't know how many of you have apps on your phone or different things right now. There's a lot of things available, and you might think you're so knowledgeable. And you're like, oh, I'm doing really good. And so on your app on your phone, it says, oh, I have a 720. I'm going to go in and I'm going to get a really good loan. I'm going to get a great rate. So, you work. You think you have a 720, because that's what your app on your phone says. And then you go in for a car loan, and then that's not what they offer you. And that's not what they pull. And so you also have to realize that auto loans, it's not necessarily, they're not pulling the same thing. And that is a composite of a lot of different things. And so that's a whole different scale. So that's actually a range, and they pull multiple things. So in addition to your score, they're also looking at your history of your auto loans, and if you've had a history of auto loans and whether you made that payment, that goes into their score as well. So it's a little different than just your credit score. So if you wonder why you've gone into a car dealership or even into your bank or credit union for an auto loan and you're thinking, oh, I got this, I'm good, and then it comes back as something a little different, what the heck happened? It's because it's not exactly the same. So that's why we do say, even when we're talking about checking a lot of, use different. The other thing is, before you go, call and ask them. Even ask what bureau they're pulling, where they're pulling your report from, where they're getting it from, so you have an idea, because it does vary. And especially when we're talking about reports, and we'll go into reports in a little bit, you'll notice, I don't know how many of you, when you actually pull them or when you get your scores from the three different ones, if you do track yours, you might notice there's like a 50 point span difference on some of them. They can be very, very different. That's because not everybody is required to, no one is required to report to the bureaus. So you might have a auto loan at the credit union and they might only be reporting to Experian. And they might not be reporting that auto loan to TransUnion. And so that actually might increase your score because it adds another length of credit onto yours. But if it goes into default, it might drop it. So it just really depends. So each one could be a little bit different. So especially if you're shopping around, call ahead and say, who are you pulling from? And ask ahead of time, because it might really affect depending where your score is, and it might be very different. But then again, know that it might not exactly be what you're thinking it's going to be, because there's other factors that go into it. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Confusing? Okay. Okay. And again, the whole idea of credit is your history. Do we have questions? No? Okay. Sorry. And again, they're trying to build your credit worthiness. So they want to know, are you going to pay back what you owe? So basically, that's bottom line it. That's what they're going for, especially if you're going on a loan. So what's in your credit report? So in the handout that I'd sent in Marshfield, and the ones that we handed out today, you all printed it out? Okay, otherwise I brought yellow ones too. So there is a sample report in there. So if you flip to the sample report, if you've pulled your reports, each of the bureaus is a little bit different, okay? So this is just one example. So if you've looked at them, they're all a little bit different, but they're generally the same. They all have the exact same categories. So, for example, so page 3, how they actually tally whether you've made your on-time payments. This particular report says okay. Some of them have a number, and one of them has a check mark. So each bureau reports it a little bit different. One actually says okay, one has a number, one has a check mark. They all do the same thing. It's just how it actually looks on your report is a little different. It's different for each bureau. But it is in there. But what you're actually looking for. So the first part on every report is your identifying information. So that's the first thing that you need to make sure. So is that social security number this right? Then it's going to give you your address, and then it has a whole section of all the places that you've lived, okay? So you need to make sure that all of those addresses are your addresses. So this is the number one thing lately that people are finding errors on, is that they're like, I've never lived in Colorado Springs. Okay, this is not me. So that's generally someone else's stolen your identity or trying to open credit with your identity. So that's usually the reason when I talked in the spring about credit reports, when we talk about identity theft, is that's why I want you to check it to make sure that someone else is not trying to use your credit. And that is probably the most common thing that's happening right now. So that section is really, really important, that identity, and making sure that that's you. Okay. Then the next section is your credit history. So then it's actually going to go through and it'll give adverse accounts, and then it gets satisfactory accounts. So the adverse accounts are ones that either were closed because they're delinquent, or if they've gone into collections or bankruptcy. So they're all there, and they can either be current or they can be ones that were from previous years. And then satisfactory accounts will be listed, and again, they'll show how many on-time payments you have. And it'll either, like this particular one says okay, some of them will have a check mark, and some of them will have a 1 for every on-time payment. They'll just have a 1 or a dash for every one. So that's what you're looking for. And most of them go back. So this one has 3 years. Some of them go back 2 years, or 2.5 is generally what they do. So that's really important because that's what they're going at, and that'll continue to show up. So that's very important. And we'll talk about it a little bit. Some of the laws that have changed in this particular year in Wisconsin on how long things can stay on and what comes off. So that's important. Okay, the next section is inquiries. Also very, very important when it comes to identity theft. So they'll do both hard and soft pulls, but they'll show you who actually requested your credit. Okay, so this is who put it in. Remember earlier I said sometimes it'll show up as a shell corporation. Not sometimes, a lot of times. And so it'll come up as like 3-digit letters, RJF or ABD. And you're like, what is that? I have no idea what that is. You can just Google it, and it'll come up and go, oh, Wells Fargo. I don't know why they do that, but they do that a lot. So if you panic, if you see this and you're like, holy smokes, I don't know what that is, Google it. It'll come up and it'll tell you that it's a shell corporation or a subsidiary of, Wells Fargo. So before you panic, just Google it to see if it comes up that way, and a lot of times it will. And if not, you can call and see. But most of the time, it will come up and let you know. But that's where you're looking to see if someone else did try to open an account. So a lot of times, again, that's where if somebody had hacked into your identity, where they tried to open something under your name. And then the last one is just public records. So this is also if there was, let's say previously, we'll talk about changes again, things like bankruptcy, foreclosure, evictions, all of those kind of things, those would show up on here. And we'll talk about law changes. But okay, questions on that? Okay, questions in Marshfield?
Nope.
Okay, what your credit report cannot contain. So they're not going to say what's in your bank account. Income, medical history, none of that. Any kind of purchases, anything relating back to your business, anything related to race, ethnicity, gender, none of that is in there. Driving records, nothing like that. So let's talk about in or out. So credit cards, in or out? In. Debit cards, out, not in there. Prepaid debit cards, out, not in there. Secured credit cards, in. Does everybody know what a secured credit card is? So a secured credit card is actually something I do recommend if you're trying to improve your credit, or if you have young people going off to college, highly recommend you do a secured credit card. So what a secured credit card is you would go to your financial institution, your bank or credit union, and you would say, I'd like to open a secured credit card. Anybody can do it. So a regular credit card, you have to be approved. Secured credit card, anybody can get a secured credit card. You would say the amount up front because you're putting the amount of money up front. So you'd say, I want a $500 secured credit card. So you would give them $500. They would order you a credit card. It comes with your name on it and everything. And it has a limit of $500. Okay? You would charge it just like you would a regular credit card. It's not a prepaid. So it's not like it's, subtracted down like a prepaid card. It actually is a credit card. It's just that you secured that money and it's hanging out there. So it still starts at zero balance and you charge and you have to pay it off every month like you would. It gets reported to the credit bureaus just like a regular credit card would. It's just that it's building your credit, and you don't start off with having to have good credit because you secured the amount of money on there to begin with. Generally, after 3 consistent payments with a secured credit card, most financial institutions will then offer you a regular credit card and they'll roll it over and then give you your money back. But it's a great way to improve your credit score rapidly, very, very fast. And again, it's open to anybody because they don't pull your credit to start a secured credit card. I usually say it's very good for kiddos going off to college because they're not ruining their credit. Because it's max the amount that you're putting on there. So, questions on that? Okay. Okay, so we went through the credit report already. Okay, you're probably all aware of this, but annualcreditreport.com, you can get one from each of the 3 bureaus every year. So you can get 3 credit reports per year, one from each of the 3 bureaus.
What are the bureaus again?
Experian, TransUnion, Equifax. And when you go on there, has everybody pulled theirs? No. Okay, so I highly recommend you go on there. So I will tell you that when you go on to annualcreditreport.com, when you go on here, there's 3 ways you can get your report. You can do it online right then and there. You can call on the phone, or you can mail in and do it via paper. If you are going to do it either on the computer or on the phone, but on the computer especially, they're going to ask you identifying questions, okay? I'm going to give you a warning that many, many, many people cannot pass the identifying questions. Don't panic. Don't panic. Very, very normal, 100% okay. That is what we want. Not that we want you to fail, but we do, because that means a hacker can't get into your identity either, okay? So try again. It generates new questions. I can't remember, I just had somebody ask me this last week, how many fails you get. It might be 3 attempts, and I usually say if you don't get it on the first try with the first one, just go to the next bureau. So try Experian. If you can't get through on the security questions on Experian, just go out, and because it's all in the same system, try TransUnion, and it'll give you a new set of questions, and I don't think I've had anybody not make it through. Then on the next try, we get in at the next bureau, because it just generates new questions. Most of the time it's related to, if you've lived in the same place for the last 20, 30 years, you're not going to have an issue. Most of the time it's, what was your employer in, 1995, or which one of these is not, your employer, or the address of your bank or your employer, which one of these did you not live at? If you've had a lot of jobs or lived at a lot of places or a lot of apartments or those kind of things, it's going to be a little more difficult. The first time I tried it, because I had a lot of people telling me this, the first time I tried it, my husband and I didn't pass either. It was asking, because I lived in North Carolina for 12 years, and it was asking like the address of my financial institution, which closed, like Wachovia closed in the mid-90s. It was taken over by somebody else. I don't know that, the address of the Wachovia Bank in Greensboro, North Carolina, that I had in 1992. I don't know that, and I can't even look it up. So yeah, that's okay, but just click out, generate the next one, and you'll be able to get through. If by chance you don't, just call on the phone and they'll ask you new questions. So don't panic. I want to tell everybody that because I don't want you to panic. If you do it on the phone, it takes 2 weeks generally for them to mail it to you. If you do it on the computer, you print it out immediately. You get it right then and there. Question?
I think when I was at the March one, or whenever you did this one, I went on, I don't know if I did all 3 credit bureaus. If I go on to this annual credit report, will it tell me that I've already done it once this year, that I can't do it again, or will it?
So if you have, then it'll charge you. So you get 1 free per year, and if you've already used your free, then it'll tell you that there's a
Free
fee.
from Experian or free from all 3?
You get 1 free from each of them.
Okay, so if it tries to charge me, then I know I've gotten it
Right.
already in March.
Yep.
So is it March to March then, or is
Yep.
it 18 to
No,
19
no, it's
to
12
25?
months. Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. Other questions on that? Okay.
Well, I have a.
Oh, yep.
I get emails all the time from that Credit Karma.
Yeah.
How accurate is that information on there?
So that's a good question. So Credit Karma is Credit Karma is legit, and it's one of the ones that we do respect, and is accepted. There's some, and we'll talk about that a little bit. There's some that we don't say, but Credit Karma is okay. But remember what I said is it's just an estimate, because it's going to change. There's a lot of other factors that go into it. So do know that it's going to give you a ballpark, but when you go into your bank or financial institution, or when you go into a car dealership, depending what you're doing, or that it might be a little different. But is it going to be in the ballpark? It is. It is generally they're within 5 to 10 points. It's pretty close. But there's other things that go into it. But generally, it's what it is that day. But when you go in for a loan, there's other things that factor into it, and they might be using another source. So they're not always, when you go in for loans, they're not always using just the score. So that's what we have to remember. So is the score legit? The score is legit, but it's that they're using other things that factor in for a loan. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but it says that it says what my TransUnion score is and my
Right.
Equifax score is.
Yep.
So,
And then there's another one. So then there's Experian as well. Yep.
Just guesses on those.
well
Yep.
then, it's weird because it says like what my credit history is.
Yep.
On one of them it's like 4 years, and the other one is like 6 years, and
Yep.
I don't understand it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago that I bought my first car and I had a car loan, so I don't understand why it's
So more than
short.
likely that loan was not reported to either of those bureaus. So it might have been reported to the third
But
bureau,
what
or not
about
at all.
my house loan that was, 17, 18 years ago?
And is that on there?
Well, I haven't gotten the credit report, but I'm concerned because my credit history is only like 4 to 6 years. Does it have anything to do with the change in my account names?
It could be. So again, and it might be what's reported to each bureau. So that's what you have to look at, and it might just be that they might be talking about certain types of credit too. But if you pull it up and you look into like each, I say pull the report, because when you actually pull it up, and it'll pull up your satisfactory accounts. So if you still have a mortgage, it'll pull up your mortgage, and then it'll say when it was started, and if it's up to current or if it's closed. So it'll give you the date that you began, and then if it's closed. So that's the length of the history. So that'll be on there.
Well, does my husband's death have any effect on the credit part?
So were accounts changed? Did the mortgage change over from his name to your name when that happened? So long story short, without going into too many details, yes. So things, yes, because
I had to change some of my accounts.
yeah. So that's one of those qualifying life things that I said earlier. Death definitely changes things over. So this should go off of your social security number. So the length of your credit should stay, but if it was in both names and changed to one name or things, it might have started the clock over on some things. So that's just something you'd have to check on. And so it might just be a phone call to the bank to say, no, really, this loan technically started at this. Can we get that adjusted, reported back to the bureau so that it gets adjusted? So that's something you can do. So that I would definitely have that pulled to make sure that that's corrected if it is wrong.
Okay.
Because it might have if you did have his name taken off the loan, and if they might have put it in as considered a new loan, and so that might have changed it.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Good question though. It's a really good question. Okay, so I know this looks like a lot of gobbledygook, and I won't go through it all, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So in 2018, this was a really big year in Wisconsin because we had some changes in that affect the way your credit reports are pulled. So, or things that are actually reported on there. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. So one really big one is medical debts. They now give you a 6-month leeway. So what had happened is that they found there were so many errors. Okay, so they were putting in things were going into collections, and they were going on your credit report, and then they were coming back 4 or 5 months later and finding out it really wasn't a collection. It was just an error, and it was on the part of, the medical or the insurance, and it just, so now they say, nope, we give you a 6-month leeway, and before it actually gets reported out as a debt, that it goes on to your credit report. So that's huge. So that made a really big difference. So that's really, really important. So that's big. The next one is judgments and tax liens are no longer on your credit report. So again, huge. So that used to show up in your credit. That would pull up on here. That's not going to come up on there anymore either. The other one is, and the reason behind that is there were so many errors and information that was so out of date in public records that they just couldn't keep up with it. So they found that it was causing people more harm, because when they did go for a loan, it was a mistake. It was just wrong because they just couldn't keep up with the information. So that's not reported in there anymore. Bankruptcies will still stay on there, and they're on there for 7 to 10 years, depending on what type of bankruptcy it is. So that's the only one that does stay, but other things are going to come off. Okay. Rental history can be added if the landlord chooses to report it. Not all choose to report, okay? So that's up to the landlord, but that can go on there. So that is their choice and who they choose to put it to. So they can send it to all 3 bureaus, or they can choose to not report it at all, okay? So when I do a class called Rent Smart, and when I'm working with tenants who have a poor credit history, I always say, drive around the county and look, for those mom and pop that just have a for rent sign in the yard, because more than likely they're not reporting to the credit bureaus. Whereas if you're going with a large company, more than likely they are reporting. So it really just kind of depends. Okay, a couple other things, and this is huge when it comes to identity theft and things we talked about, is you can now put a lift on and do a freeze, and there's no cost to it. It used to be $10 every time you put it on and took it off, but that is gone. So that came into effect in September. So that's there. The other one is you can now do a fraud alert on your credit report for a whole year. It used to be 90 days, and now that's in there for an entire year. So if you think that something might be fishy, or you're a little concerned about it, you can go ahead and put that on at no cost for a whole year. Okay? Okay. Questions about any of those? Okay, so let's talk. We got about a little bit of time. So credit scores, actual scores. So good score, this really depends, but most lenders go with a 720 and up. So some say 750, but generally 720 and up is pretty good. That's a very good score. But again, doesn't mean that if you have that 720 or 750 and you go in for an auto loan that you're going to get a 0% interest rate, because there's other factors that go into it. So don't just bank on this. And that doesn't mean that your Credit Karma was wrong. It just means there's other factors that went into it. Okay? Okay. So you guys may have seen this before, but this is what builds that FICO score. So 35% payment history, 30% amounts owed, 50% length of credit history, that's why we talked about that earlier, 10% new credit, and then how much is currently in use. Okay, so 35% of that payment history. So they want to know how you've handled that credit in the past, And are you currently making your on-time payments? So that is absolutely huge. So that is number one. So I always tell people the biggest point is, are you making on-time payments? Every time you make those consistent on-time payments, that is most important. So stick with that. And it doesn't make a difference what type of credit it is. That's what it looks. So I always tell people the second, someone will go, oh, I had one of the things on your report, or if you're using Credit Karma, it'll say, any late payments. It doesn't make a difference what it looks like on here. It's the okays, the checks, or the number ones. This really affects it. And it can drop, depending on your score, it can drop 30, 50 points just by one missed payment. So it's huge. So really pay attention to that, because this is the biggest chunk of your score, is that payment history and those on-time payments. Okay, 30% is the total amount owed and your available credit. So that amount that you owe and all of your loans, whether it's credit cards, your car loan, mortgage, whatever it is, that's really important, especially if you're taking on credit card debt, things like that. Making sure that you're trying to pay it off every month and you're paying more than the minimum, really huge. So keep that in, and you want to go less than 40%, yes. So huge. So, they might say, oh, it's a $25 minimum payment. Don't do that. So make sure that if you have the ability to pay it off every month, or at least make sure that you're doing less than 40% of your max. So that's huge. And it makes a big difference on that available. Okay. Here, this is that length of credit history. So this is why that's important. So 15% of your score is how long that you've had those accounts. So, and that's all of those accounts. So that is why they look into that. So that's really important.
So with
Yep.
my credit cards, does it make a difference that I got new credit cards since he died, because we didn't keep the one we had together?
But same company.
Yeah.
So I would say that's going to count as a new one.
Okay. Because I think all my credit cards are ones that I've gotten since he died.
Yeah, so they're new. So that'll show up as newer credit, but your old stuff you still had credit before, so that would still show up in here as previous. It'll just show as a closed account. And it'll say closed in good standing. It'll just say closed. So it might say date closed 2007. And it just depends on the report. It might say closed in good standing. But it'll show, all on-time payments, and yeah, so it's not bad. But yeah. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay. Oh, the other one is that I want to make sure is that variety of credit too. So that's really important. Is, remember in that first slide we talked about all the different types. That's the other piece of this, is it's not just it's how many different kinds you have. That's what they're looking at too. So if you just had a mortgage and you had a car loan and you close that car loan and you think, oh, I paid off my car loan, this is great, this is gonna jump up my score. It might not, because if you only had two types of credit and now you closed off that car loan and now you only have your mortgage, you don't have, that might be a hit, because you now don't have a variety of credit. So again, it's not for everybody, it's not the same, but it just depends on your piece, but that could not necessarily be good. Does that make sense? So just kind of keep that in mind. So where do you get your credit? So like I said, your credit report is one thing, your credit score. So you had mentioned the free one, so you can get things like Credit Karma or Quizzle, but you can also purchase one. You can go to FICO, or you can get estimate ones from places like Bankrate that has calculators that will give you estimates. Sometimes your bank or credit union or your credit card will also do them for free. So ask them as well. And most of the time they don't advertise it or promote it, but if you go in to customer service, they'll pull it for you and they'll give it to you. I don't know about you guys, but so I don't know if you check your credit report. So I checked my credit report, and it tells me that my credit union does pull mine every fall. So I know that they're pulling it in every August anyways. So then I know that I can go and just ask for a copy of that. So as long as I know that they're pulling it, I can ask for a copy of it. So I just go, and as long as they're pulling it, it's not going to be an additional hit.
How could they be pulling it, just to make sure like there's no fraud?
Because I have loans through them too.
Oh, okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay. So when you're going in, for, like I said, if you're shopping around for credit, just make sure you find out, you can call ahead and find out who they're using for bureaus, where they're pulling from. Ask what's in the contract. Make sure you read everything very carefully. A lot of times we're focused on what the interest is, but there's a lot of other things that go into it too. And feel free to ask before you go in. A lot of people feel like really pressured when you get in there, but you can ask ahead of time. So do your homework and ask before you go in there, especially if you're someone that feels really pressured. So do your homework before you go, and by law they have to offer it to you. So if you're someone that's like, oh, I want to get as much, I don't want to feel pressured, call ahead and ask that information and do your homework before you go, and they will give it to you. So that's good. So some of the questions that you want to ask, so the annual interest rate, are there any additional fees? What are consequences if you have missed payments? If things aren't paid back in full, and then are you totally comfortable with who it is? So if it's a bank or a credit union, yep, more than likely you're going to be. But if there are, there's some national ones, I'm not going to name them, but some national lenders that are considered almost predatory lenders, and they're big banks, but they are, and so they are known to be almost predatory. So do your homework and ask around, because they can be very detrimental to you. As you're going through that contract, just kind of go through almost with a fine-tooth comb and look through everything and make sure you read it. I always say to people, even if we're doing like a landlord-tenant in your application, read it. It's actual legal binding contract. And I feel like everybody gives you something and they expect you to just sign it and not pay attention to it. It's pages and pages. Again, you can ask for this ahead of time or ask to take it and read it. And make sure you're paying attention to all these things, because it's really important. And it can have many years worth of consequences on you. And then lastly, just know what your rights and responsibilities are as a borrower, because it can affect you your whole life. So, simple things now, you might think, oh, this is really silly, but it can affect, what you're doing in retirement. So decisions that you make today can have impacts years and years and years down the road. And it's unfortunate when we have, college kids or, teenagers that are making decisions at 18, 19, 20 that really do affect whether they buy a home or what they do, in their 30s and 40s. And they're playing catch up by those decisions that they made early. So really, it is important. So I hope not only you, that you share with others too, because it makes a big difference. That's what we have. The one thing I didn't go into that I wanted to, but we're out of time, so I don't want to make you late to get back to the office, is on the bottom of they're not page, but a little bit about the credit score and how things affect your credit score. I just want to call your attention really quick. This is just a sample from Credit Karma, but it just kind of goes into two different people. So it talks about Jane and John. And Jane, starting off, has a pretty decent credit score. Her credit score starting off is like 793. And John is starting off with a 576. And you can see as they go through and do a couple different things, how it might change them. And remember, I said a couple times today, things that might seem like a really good thing for one person might make your score go up. For someone else, it can make your score go down, or it can be just not across the board. So you might hear something from your financial advisor or read in a book that you're like, oh, this sounds great. This is going to do really, really good. Not necessarily. So it's not a be-all, end-all. It's not like, oh, this is the magic answer and this is what you do. It's not like that. It is individual for everybody and how it affects your score. So there are general things. Like I said, go back to what the percentages are on that score, and those are good practices, but know that it may affect everybody a little bit different. Because if you have a really high score and you do something, it's going to affect you differently than if you're starting off with a 600. somebody with a 600 and somebody with a 750, they can do the same thing and it's going to have a different effect on their scores. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I have a question. I have an 85-year-old aunt that I took care of her money.
Yep.
And all of a sudden this year she thought she should maybe get a credit card. Where that come from, I don't know. But she doesn't owe, you know, she doesn't have a house payment, she doesn't pay rent. She has, so what kind of credit score would someone like that have? That's what I was gonna say. I said, I don't even think you could get one, cause she doesn't have any, she's got money, you know, I mean.
More than
that's-
likely 0.
Okay.
So that happens a lot. So generally it's young people starting out, or someone who was married and the spouse, everything was in the spouse's name, or someone who was widowed, and they have a really hard time because they don't have a credit at all. And you'd think that we'd start off with something and we can build. It's not always like that. And so it's, yeah, so it just depends.
I don't even think you could probably get one, cause you don't have a secure direction.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so.
easily, and she's got money, I mean, it's not like she don't have money,
Yep.
you know, but it was
So
just like.
it, yeah, so it just depends. So, you might, through a bank or credit union that she's had an account at, they might find her less of a risk.
Okay.
And so they might give her one, but
Yeah.
if she just went to like Capital One, probably not, because if they pulled her up, there's gonna be nothing there. There's no history. There's nothing at all. So it really just depends. So yeah, that happens a lot, more so less in the last, 15 years, because, not that I think women are, but we have less of just things being in one person's name. I think we're becoming more aware and we're putting accounts in both people's names, and both spouses are having their names on things. But from when I first started out 20 years ago, that was a very common thing, is that everything was in one person's name. And so when they passed away, the other one had a really hard time because their name wasn't on anything. And so if they were starting over, 50s, 60s, they didn't have credit. And it was very, very difficult. So at least now with, names, being, loans and leases and bank accounts being in both names, it's a little more, it's easier. But that's a perfect example of no. So, is that? So I will also say, anytime, I also offer financial coaching, one-on-one. So similar to what Adam does with wellness. Anytime, call with questions. We can set up your own goals, what you want to work on, and we just touch base with how you're doing. So if you have any questions that you want to sit up and go through, call me anytime and we can do that. So more than willing to work with you. Yep. What was your question?
Oh, there's.
Okay. So, thanks everybody.